Imagine owning 15% of North America, not investing in it, not governing it, owning it. That's 1.5 million square miles. Bigger than India. Larger than the entire European Union. More territory than 40 US states combined. And it all belonged to one company. A trading company that most people have never heard of. For 200 years, the Hudson's Bay Company didn't just participate in North American commerce, they controlled it with an iron fist. Every beaver pelt, every trading route. Every indigenous tribe that wanted European goods had to go through them. They set prices across half a continent. They decided which settlements lived or died. They commanded private armies larger than most nations. But what nobody knows is how they pulled it off. How did a handful of English merchants convince a king to hand them territory larger than modern-day Mexico? How did they maintain absolute control for 2 centuries while fighting off French armies, American expansion, and countless rivals? The secret wasn't military might. It wasn't superior technology. It was something far more cunning, something that made them richer than today's tech giants, more powerful than modern corporations, and more ruthless than any monopoly you've ever heard of. This is the story of how the Hudson's Bay Company became the most powerful trading empire in human history, how they built a business model so dominant that it took 2 centuries and the combined forces of 3 nations to finally break their stranglehold on North America. Chapter 1, Royal Charter. You're about to witness the most audacious corporate takeover in human history. May 2nd, 1670, the Palace of Westminster. King Charles II sits at his massive oak desk, quill pen hovering over a document that will reshape North America. Around him stand 17 of England's wealthiest merchants, including his own cousin Prince Rupert. They're not asking for trading rights. They're not requesting colonial permission. They're demanding ownership of 1/3 of modern Canada. The charter they've drafted is breathtaking in its scope. It grants them sole trade and commerce over all lands whose rivers drain into Hudson Bay. They have no idea how vast this territory actually is. The Hudson Bay watershed covers nearly 1.5 million square miles, stretching from the Rockies to Labrador, from the Arctic to the American Midwest. But Charles doesn't care about geography. He needs money. The Great Fire of London had devastated the city 4 years earlier. The plague had killed 100,000 people. Wars with the Dutch were draining the royal treasury. Charles was so desperate for revenue that he'd already mortgaged crown jewels to Amsterdam moneylenders. These merchants were offering him something better than a loan. They were offering him a cut of North American wealth without risking a single English soldier. You see, the charter wasn't just about trading rights. It was about sovereign power. The document Charles signed gave the Hudson's Bay Company authority to make laws, collect taxes, maintain armies, build fortifications, and declare war. They could arrest anyone, seize any property, execute any judgment. Within their territory, they weren't just a trading company, they were the government. Prince Rupert had studied the Dutch model carefully. The Dutch East India Company hadn't just traded with Asian kingdoms, they'd conquered them. They'd used commercial monopolies to build the richest empire in Europe. The VOC's shareholders had earned how 200% returns over 60 years. Rupert wanted those returns for England. Here's what's remarkable. The charter didn't require the company to explore their territory, map it, or even visit it. They just had to maintain the monopoly. As long as no other English traders operated in Hudson Bay, the company owned it forever. The 17 original shareholders included some of the most powerful men in England. The Duke of York, future King James II, Earl of Craven, one of Charles's closest advisors, Sir Peter Colleton, who owned sugar plantations worked by thousands of enslaved Africans. These weren't merchants gambling on uncertain ventures. These were England's elite investing in guaranteed dominance. They called themselves the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England, trading into Hudson's Bay. The word adventurers didn't mean explorers. It was 17th century business terminology for venture capitalists. These were professional risk managers who had calculated that monopoly control of North American furs would generate unprecedented profits. The mathematics were staggering. A beaver pelt that cost trade goods worth 2 shillings in Hudson Bay sold for 40 shillings in London hat shops. That's a 2,000% markup. But the real genius was volume control. By monopolizing supply, they could manipulate European prices at will. What the French didn't understand was that the Hudson's Bay Company had solved the fundamental problem of North American trade: distance. French traders had to transport furs over 3,000 miles of wilderness, rivers, and lakes. Every mile added costs, risks, and opportunities for competitors to interfere. The Hudson's Bay route was 200 miles of open ocean sailing directly to London. But Charles II had given them something even more valuable than geography: legal immunity. The charter protected company traders from prosecution under English law for anything they did in North America. They could trade weapons to indigenous nations, manipulate tribal conflicts, or destroy French settlements without facing criminal charges in London courts. This wasn't oversight, it was deliberate policy. Charles wanted the company to wage commercial war against France without official English involvement. I mean, think about this. Imagine Amazon receiving a government charter that made Jeff Bezos immune from all laws within the company's territory. Imagine Apple being granted the right to maintain private armies and collect taxes. That's exactly what King Charles II gave the Hudson's Bay Company. The signing ceremony was brief but significant. Prince Rupert became the company's first governor, a position that made him ruler of territory larger than most European kingdoms. The other 16 subscribers each invested $300, equivalent to roughly $50,000 today. For that modest investment, they became owners of 15% of North America. Within hours of signing the charter, the company began planning their first expedition. They would establish trading posts at the mouths of major rivers flowing into Hudson Bay. These wouldn't be temporary camps. They would be permanent fortifications designed to maintain English control for generations. But first, they needed to handle the French problem. New France claimed Hudson Bay under Samuel de Champlain's earlier explorations. The French had built a vast network of alliances with indigenous nations throughout the Great Lakes region. French voyageurs and coureurs de bois had been trading in Hudson Bay waters for decades. They weren't going to surrender their most profitable territory to English merchants without a fight. The Hudson's Bay Company understood this perfectly. That's why their charter included military provisions. They could make peace or war with any prince or people whatsoever that are not Christians. This language gave them authority to form military alliances with indigenous nations against French traders. Look, the company's founders weren't naive idealists. They knew they were starting a continental war disguised as a business venture. They knew their monopoly would require constant military defense. They knew they would have to destroy French trading networks to make their model work. By Christmas 1670, the Hudson's Bay Company had commissioned their first ships and recruited their first traders. These weren't ordinary merchants. They were carefully selected men with military experience, wilderness survival skills, and absolute loyalty to company interests. Men willing to spend years in Arctic isolation, defending England's newest and most valuable asset. The most generous corporate charter in history had created the most powerful trading company on earth. Now they had to prove they could hold what the king had given them. But the French weren't going to make that easy. And neither were the indigenous nations who actually controlled the territory the English claimed to own. Chapter 2. Fur War's war was coming to Hudson Bay, and everyone knew it. The French struck first, not with armies or warships, but with something far more dangerous: indigenous alliances that had taken them 60 years to build. Governor-General Louis de Boisde, Comte de Frontenac, controlled New France from his fortress in Quebec City. When news of the English charter reached him in 1671, he immediately grasped the threat. The Hudson's Bay Company wasn't just challenging French trade monopolies. They were trying to cut the economic lifeline that sustained French North America. You see, the fur trade wasn't just business for New France. It was survival. Without beaver pelts to sell in European markets, the French colonies would collapse. Their entire economy depended on indigenous hunters bringing furs to French trading posts along the St. Lawrence River. If those hunters could sail directly to English posts on Hudson Bay, French settlements from Montreal to Detroit would starve. Frontenac's response was brilliant and ruthless. He couldn't stop English ships from reaching Hudson Bay, but he could make sure they found empty wilderness when they arrived. The Governor-General dispatched Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, the most feared military commander in North America. D'Iberville had spent his entire life fighting in the North American wilderness. He spoke fluent Cree and Ojibwe. He understood that control of Hudson Bay wouldn't be won by European military tactics. It would be won by whoever could secure indigenous cooperation. Meanwhile, the Hudson's Bay Company was learning harsh lessons about the realities of North American geography. Their first expedition reached Hudson Bay in September 1670, just weeks before the brutal Arctic winter locked the region in ice for 8 months. Charles Bailey, the company's first overseas governor, established Fort Charles at the mouth of the Rupert River with exactly 19 men. 19 Englishmen trying to control territory larger than Spain. These weren't career soldiers or experienced frontiersmen. Most were London craftsmen and laborers who had never seen wilderness, let alone survived an Arctic winter. They had no understanding of local indigenous nations, no knowledge of trading protocols, and no idea that French agents were already spreading word of their arrival throughout the region. The winter of 1670-1671 nearly destroyed the entire Hudson's Bay Company venture. Temperatures dropped to -40 Fahrenheit. Scurvy killed 6 of Bailey's men. The rest survived on stored salt pork and whatever game they could shoot. By spring, half the survivors were too sick to work. But something remarkable happened that saved the company from complete disaster. Cree hunters began arriving at Fort Charles in spring 1671. Not just a few individuals, entire family groups with hundreds of prime beaver pelts. They paddled massive birch bark canoes down rivers the English didn't know existed, carrying furs worth thousands of pounds in London markets. What the English didn't understand was that these Cree nations had been planning this for months. Indigenous intelligence networks had carried news of the English arrival across thousands of miles of wilderness, faster than any European communication system. Tribal councils had debated the implications. Economic decisions had been made. The Cree weren't naive about European politics. They understood that French and English competition would drive up fur prices. They knew that monopoly control by either European power would limit their negotiating leverage. Many Cree leaders had decided that encouraging English trading posts would create the competitive marketplace that served indigenous interests. But the French weren't going to allow this without a fight. D'Iberville struck during the summer of 1672. He led a mixed force of French soldiers and indigenous warriors overland from Quebec, a journey of over 800 miles through unmapped wilderness. When they reached Hudson Bay, they found Fort Charles defended by 12 Englishmen with muskets designed for European battlefields, not wilderness warfare. The attack lasted less than an hour. D'Iberville's forces used tactics the English had never encountered, coordinated strikes from multiple directions, psychological warfare involving war cries and burning arrows, and rapid withdrawal when English musket fire became concentrated. The French didn't try to capture the fort. They destroyed the company's supply warehouses, captured their trading goods, and disappeared back into the wilderness. Charles Bailey was forced to abandon Fort Charles and retreat to a ship anchored in the bay. The Hudson's Bay Company's first attempt at permanent settlement had failed completely. Here's what's interesting. The French attack actually strengthened the company's position in London. Prince Rupert used the raid as evidence that the Hudson's Bay monopoly was under serious threat from French military aggression. He convinced King Charles II that defending the company's charter was defending English national interests. The result was a massive increase in government support. The Royal Navy began escorting company ships to Hudson Bay. The company received permission to recruit military officers for their trading posts. Most importantly, they gained access to improved weapons, including small cannons specifically designed for fort defense. The 1673 trading season marked a turning point. The company established 3 new posts simultaneously: Fort Albany, Fort Moose, and a rebuilt Fort Charles. Each was fortified according to military engineering principles, with cannon positions covering river approaches and thick wooden walls designed to withstand siege warfare. But the real revolution was in their trading strategy. The company abandoned European concepts of fixed prices and formal negotiations. Instead, they adopted indigenous trading protocols based on gift exchange, relationship building, and flexible bartering. English traders learned to speak Cree and Ojibwe. They participated in ceremonial smoking rituals, They offered credit terms that allowed indigenous hunters to receive goods in spring and pay with furs in fall. This wasn't cultural sensitivity, it was calculated business strategy. The company had realized that successful North American trading required indigenous cooperation on indigenous terms. European commercial practices simply didn't work in wilderness environments where reputation and relationship mattered more than contracts or legal enforcement. The French response was predictable and devastating. D'Iberville returned in 1674 with a larger force and new tactics. Instead of attacking company forts directly, he targeted their indigenous trading partners. French raiders intercepted Cree hunting parties traveling to English posts. They offered higher prices for furs, but only if hunters agreed to abandon English trading relationships permanently. When economic incentives weren't sufficient, D'Iberville used violence. Cree leaders who continued trading with the English found their villages raided, their canoes destroyed, their stored food supplies burned. The French weren't just competing for furs. They were terrorizing entire indigenous nations into submission. But this strategy backfired spectacularly. Many Cree and Ojibwe nations viewed French attacks on indigenous traders as violations of sovereignty. Tribal councils that had remained neutral in European conflicts began actively supporting English trading posts as a form of resistance to French aggression. By 1675, indigenous warriors were helping defend company forts against French raids. The Fur Wars had become a continental conflict involving dozens of nations and hundreds of communities. What started as competition between two European trading companies had evolved into a struggle for indigenous independence and economic self-determination. And the Hudson's Bay Company was learning how to fight a wilderness war. They recruited voyageurs who had defected from French service. They established intelligence networks among indigenous nations throughout the Great Lakes region. They began using the same tactics that had made D'Iberville so effective: surprise attacks, rapid movement, and strategic alliances with local peoples. By 1676, the Hudson's Bay Company was generating profits that exceeded their shareholders' wildest expectations. Despite constant warfare, despite logistical nightmares, despite operating in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, they were extracting wealth from North America at an unprecedented rate. But the French weren't finished. D'Iberville was planning something that would either destroy the Hudson's Bay Company forever or provoke a full-scale war between England and France. The greatest battle in Hudson Bay's history was about to begin. Chapter 3: Trading Posts. Building an empire requires more than just royal permission. It requires infrastructure that can survive anything your enemies throw at it. By 1680, the Hudson's Bay Company had learned this lesson the hard way. Their early posts were glorified hunting cabins that French raiders could burn down in an afternoon. If they wanted to hold their monopoly, they needed fortifications that could withstand siege warfare in the harshest climate on Earth. The solution came from an unexpected source: indigenous engineering knowledge. James Knight, the company's new chief factor at Fort Albany, was a former ship's carpenter who understood construction but knew nothing about Arctic survival. His post was failing until Cree elders began teaching his men how to build structures that could handle -50 temperatures, howling winds, and 8-month winters without resupply. The breakthrough was the Hudson's Bay Company house design, a hybrid of European and indigenous architecture that became the template for hundreds of trading posts across North America. These weren't just buildings, they were carefully engineered survival systems. Double-walled log construction with insulation made from moss, animal hair, and birch bark. Massive stone fireplaces that could burn continuously for months without overheating wooden structures. Underground root cellars that kept food frozen throughout the winter. Workshop areas where traders could repair tools, manufacture trade goods, and maintain weapons during the long isolation. But the real genius was in the defensive design. Each trading post was built like a medieval fortress adapted for musket warfare. Thick wooden walls with gun ports positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, corner bastions that allowed defenders to shoot at attackers approaching any wall, central courtyards that could shelter indigenous trading parties during French raids. The company spared no expense on these installations, A single major trading post required investment equivalent to $2 million in today's money, but they understood that controlling strategic river mouths was worth any cost. Fort York became their masterpiece. Located at the mouth of the Hayes River, it controlled access to the richest fur country in North America. The company brought in military engineers from London to design walls that could withstand cannon bombardment. They installed artillery pieces capable of sinking warships in the bay. They built living quarters for 200 people and warehouse space for 50,000 beaver pelts. Here's what made these posts truly revolutionary. They weren't just military installations or commercial centers. They were complete economic ecosystems. Each fort contained blacksmith shops where indigenous hunters could repair metal tools, trading rooms stocked with thousands of items: knives, axes, kettles, blankets, firearms, ammunition, tobacco, rum, and luxury goods like silk ribbons and silver jewelry. Medical facilities where company surgeons treated both Europeans and indigenous people. Even schools where children learned to read and write in multiple languages. The company had realized that success required providing services that indigenous nations couldn't get anywhere else. French traders might offer competitive prices for furs, but they couldn't match the comprehensive economic infrastructure that Hudson's Bay posts provided. But building these fortresses required solving massive logistical challenges. Every nail, every brick, every piece of glass had to be shipped from England in the holds of sailing ships that could only reach Hudson Bay during the 3-month summer season. Construction materials often spent entire winters buried under snow, waiting for spring thaws that allowed transportation to fort sites. The company developed specialized supply chains that operated like military campaigns. Ships left London in April, carrying precisely calculated loads, enough food, tools, trade goods, and construction materials to sustain each post for an entire year. Captains carried detailed manifests specifying exactly which items went to which forts. A single miscalculation could doom an entire trading post to starvation or defenselessness. Indigenous knowledge proved essential for every aspect of construction. Cree and Ojibwe craftsmen taught company builders how to select trees that would resist rot in humid conditions. They showed Europeans how to chink log walls with materials that would expand and contract without creating gaps. They demonstrated preservation techniques that kept food supplies safe from bears, wolverines, and other wilderness threats. By 1685, the Hudson's Bay Company operated 12 major trading posts and dozens of smaller outposts throughout the Hudson Bay watershed. Each was positioned to control a specific river system and the indigenous nations who used it for transportation and hunting. These posts became the nerve centers of a commercial intelligence network that spanned half a continent. Company traders maintained detailed records of fur prices, weather patterns, indigenous political developments, French military movements, and economic conditions throughout their territory. This information flowed back to London headquarters, where directors used it to make strategic decisions affecting the entire North American economy. You see, the company wasn't just reacting to market conditions, they were creating them. By controlling the supply of beaver pelts reaching European markets, they could manipulate prices in their favor. When London hat manufacturers complained about high fur costs, company directors could point to French military threats and justify premium prices. When indigenous hunters demanded better trade goods, company factors could cite transportation expenses and maintain profit margins. But the French weren't passive observers of English fort building. They were developing counter-strategies that would challenge the entire Hudson's Bay system. Pierre Lemoyne d'Iberville had spent years studying company trading posts, mapping their defenses, and identifying weaknesses. He understood that direct military assault was costly and uncertain. Instead, he began targeting the supply lines that kept English forts operational. French raiders started intercepting company supply ships in Hudson Strait, the narrow waters connecting Hudson Bay to the Atlantic Ocean. A single successful raid could capture an entire year's supplies for multiple trading posts. English forts that had seemed impregnable suddenly faced starvation and abandonment. The company's response was to fortify their supply routes as heavily as their trading posts. They began escorting merchant ships with armed vessels. They established supply depots on islands throughout Hudson Bay where emergency stores could be cached. They developed overland supply routes that could operate even when sea lanes were blocked. This escalation was enormously expensive. The company's military costs were approaching their trading profits. Shareholders began questioning whether the Hudson's Bay monopoly was financially sustainable, given the constant warfare required to maintain it. But then something unexpected happened that changed everything. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 overthrew King James II and brought Protestant monarchs William and Mary to the English throne. France's Louis XIV refused to recognize the new English government, leading to open warfare between the two nations. The fur wars in Hudson Bay suddenly became part of a global conflict. This transformed the Hudson's Bay Company's strategic position completely. Instead of funding private warfare against French traders, they could now request official military support from the Royal Navy and English Army. Their trading posts became strategic assets in England's larger struggle against French expansion. The result was a massive escalation in the militarization of Hudson Bay. The company received government funding to expand their fortifications. Royal Navy warships began patrolling Hudson Bay waters year-round. English military engineers arrived to upgrade trading post defenses with the latest siege warfare technology. But the French response was even more dramatic. Louis XIV commissioned d'Iberville to lead a full-scale military expedition aimed at destroying English presence in Hudson Bay permanently. The greatest siege in North American history was about to begin at Fort York, and the outcome would determine whether the Hudson's Bay Company's monopoly survived or collapsed under French assault. These weren't just trading posts anymore. They had become the fortified front lines of a continental empire. The question was whether English engineering and indigenous alliances could withstand the most formidable military commander in North America. Chapter 4: Native Alliances. The Hudson's Bay Company's survival depended on relationships they barely understood with people whose languages they couldn't speak. This wasn't a minor business challenge, it was an existential crisis. The company claimed to own 1.5 million square miles of North America, but indigenous nations had actually controlled this territory for thousands of years. Every river, every hunting ground, every transportation route was governed by complex treaties, territorial agreements and political relationships between dozens of sovereign nations. The English had to figure out how to insert themselves into this system without triggering the kind of massive indigenous uprising that had nearly destroyed Virginia and New England colonies. Their solution was revolutionary for its time. They decided to join indigenous political networks rather than trying to conquer or replace them. This wasn't altruism, it was calculated business strategy developed by George Guyer, the company's most successful chief factor. Guyer had spent 3 winters living with Cree families, learning their languages, participating in their ceremonies, and observing their political decision-making processes. What he discovered changed how the Hudson's Bay Company understood North American commerce. Indigenous nations weren't just suppliers of beaver pelts. They were sophisticated economic and political entities with complex international relationships. The Cree Confederation controlled territory from Hudson Bay to the Rocky Mountains. The Ojibwe Nation dominated the Great Lakes region. The Assiniboine people controlled the crucial corridor between the Saskatchewan River and the Missouri River. These weren't tribes struggling for survival in a harsh wilderness. These were powerful nations with organized governments, professional armies, extensive trade networks, and diplomatic protocols that European colonists had never encountered. Guyer realized that the Hudson's Bay Company couldn't succeed by treating indigenous people as individual customers or economic subordinates. They had to engage with indigenous nations as equals in formal political and commercial relationships. The breakthrough came during the winter of 1682-83 at Fort Albany. A delegation of Cree chiefs arrived to negotiate what they called a friendship treaty with the Hudson's Bay Company. But this wasn't the kind of land cession agreement that characterized European colonization elsewhere. The Cree weren't selling territory or surrendering sovereignty. They were proposing a complex partnership that would benefit both nations while maintaining indigenous political independence. Chief Matonabbee, the lead Cree negotiator, spoke through interpreters with company factor James Knight for 12 days. The discussions covered everything from fur prices to military cooperation, from territorial boundaries to dispute resolution mechanisms. What emerged was unprecedented in North American colonial history, a formal alliance between a European corporation and indigenous nations, based on mutual respect and shared economic interests. The agreement established specific protocols that governed Hudson's Bay Company operations throughout indigenous territory. Company traders could establish posts at river mouths and strategic portages, but they couldn't claim ownership of the surrounding land. They could trade with any indigenous person, but they had to respect traditional hunting territories and seasonal migration patterns. In exchange, Cree nations agreed to provide military protection for company posts, exclusive trading relationships within specific territories, and crucial intelligence about French military movements. But the real genius was in the economic structure. Instead of the exploitative extraction relationships that characterized European colonialism elsewhere, the Hudson's Bay Company and indigenous nations created a system of economic interdependence. Indigenous hunters received not just trade goods, but access to European technology that dramatically improved their quality of life. Company traders received not just furs, but indigenous knowledge that made survival and success possible in North American wilderness. This partnership model spread rapidly throughout the Hudson Bay watershed. The company negotiated formal agreements with Ojibwe nations around Lake Superior, Assiniboine confederations along the Saskatchewan River, and Inuit communities throughout the Arctic coast. Each agreement was specifically tailored to local political structures and economic needs. The Ojibwe Treaty emphasized territorial autonomy and traditional governance systems. The Assiniboine Agreement focused on protecting their role as intermediaries in plains trade networks. The Inuit arrangements recognized their specialized knowledge of Arctic hunting and navigation. Here's what made these alliances so powerful. They created mutual dependency that served both indigenous and company interests while limiting opportunities for French interference. Indigenous nations gained access to European military technology that enhanced their ability to defend traditional territories against hostile neighbors. Steel weapons, gunpowder, and horses transformed indigenous warfare capabilities. But equally important were peaceful technologies, metal tools that made farming and hunting more efficient, woolen clothing that provided better protection against harsh weather, medical supplies that reduced disease mortality. The Hudson's Bay Company gained something even more valuable, indigenous expertise that made their North American operations profitable. Cree guides showed company explorers how to navigate river systems that weren't on any European maps. Ojibwe hunters taught English traders how to identify the best beaver territories. Assiniboine diplomats helped negotiate safe passage through regions controlled by potentially hostile nations. This wasn't just practical knowledge, it was strategic intelligence that gave the company decisive advantages over French competitors. Indigenous allies provided advance warning of French military movements, detailed information about rival trading operations, and political intelligence that helped the company anticipate and counter French diplomatic initiatives. But perhaps most importantly, indigenous alliances gave the Hudson's Bay Company legitimacy within North American political systems that French traders couldn't match. When French officials claimed that Hudson Bay belonged to New France, indigenous leaders could point to formal treaties with the English company. When French traders tried to establish posts in Hudson Bay territory, indigenous warriors could legitimately attack them as violations of sovereign agreements. The psychological impact was enormous. French traders operating in Hudson Bay region knew they were violating indigenous law as well as challenging English commercial interests. This made recruitment difficult, logistics dangerous, and long-term planning nearly impossible. But the alliance system also created obligations that the Hudson's Bay Company couldn't ignore. Indigenous nations expected the company to honor traditional diplomatic protocols. Trade negotiations required ceremonial gift exchanges that could cost hundreds of pounds worth of goods before any commercial business began. Dispute resolution followed indigenous legal procedures that might require company traders to pay compensation for accidents or misunderstandings that wouldn't be actionable under English law. Most challenging was the expectation of military support during inter-tribal conflicts. When Cree nations went to war against Dakota, peoples along the southern edges of Hudson Bay territory, They expected company allies to provide weapons, ammunition, and sometimes direct military assistance. When Ojibwe communities faced raids from Iroquois war parties, they assumed Hudson's Bay traders would help defend their villages. These weren't requests, they were obligations under the formal treaties the company had signed. Refusing military support could end indigenous alliances that took years to negotiate and made the entire company monopoly possible. The company handled these challenges by developing what they called balanced intervention policies. They would provide defensive military support to protect indigenous communities from external aggression, but they avoided offensive operations that might escalate conflicts or create new enemies. This approach required extraordinary diplomatic skill from company traders. They had to maintain relationships with dozens of indigenous nations while avoiding entanglement in conflicts that could destabilize the entire region. James Isham, the company's most successful indigenous diplomat, spent over 30 years managing these relationships. He spoke 6 indigenous languages fluently. He had formal adoption relationships with Cree and Ojibwe families. He understood the complex kinship networks, political hierarchies, and cultural protocols that governed indigenous diplomacy. Isham's journals reveal the enormous complexity of Hudson's Bay Company indigenous relations. A typical month might include formal negotiations with Cree chiefs about territorial boundaries, mediation of disputes between Ojibwe hunters and company traders, consultation with Assiniboine leaders about military threats from the south, and ceremonial participation in religious rituals that maintained spiritual relationships with indigenous communities. Look, this wasn't cultural anthropology, it was business strategy that required total immersion in indigenous political systems. Company success depended on understanding not just what indigenous nations wanted from trade relationships, but how their political decision-making processes worked, what their economic priorities were, and how European presence affected their relationships with neighboring peoples. The French never mastered this level of cultural integration. French traders remained culturally European while operating in indigenous territory. They expected indigenous people to adapt to French commercial practices, French legal systems, and French political authority. The Hudson's Bay Company took the opposite approach. They adapted their business practices to indigenous cultural norms while maintaining their ultimate commercial objectives. This cultural flexibility became their decisive strategic advantage. By 1690, the company had formal alliances with indigenous nations controlling over 80% of the Hudson Bay watershed. These weren't just trade agreements. They were political relationships that made French expansion into Hudson Bay territory virtually impossible. But the French had one final card to play. Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville was planning a massive military expedition that would test whether indigenous alliances could withstand European siege warfare. The greatest battle for control of Hudson Bay was about to determine whether cooperation or conquest would shape the future of North America. Chapter 5: Beaver Empire. By 1690, the Hudson's Bay Company had achieved something unprecedented in commercial history. They controlled the supply of the world's most valuable luxury commodity. Beaver felt hats weren't just fashion accessories. They were symbols of wealth, status, and social position throughout Europe. Kings wore beaver crowns. Merchants displayed beaver wealth. Military officers commanded respect through beaver uniforms. The global demand seemed infinite, and the Hudson's Bay Company controlled the only reliable source of the premium pelts that European hatmakers required. This wasn't just market dominance. It was economic alchemy that transformed wilderness animals into London wealth. The numbers were staggering. A single prime beaver pelt that cost the company trade goods worth 2 shillings in Hudson Bay sold for 40 shillings in London wholesale markets. Hat manufacturers paid up to £4 for the finest pelts. European consumers spent the equivalent of a year's wages for a single high-quality beaver hat. But the real genius was in understanding the biology of beaver fur production. Beavers in the Hudson Bay region grew thicker, denser fur than those found anywhere else in North America. The harsh Arctic winters forced evolutionary adaptations that created exactly the fiber properties that European hatmakers needed. Long guard hairs that could be removed easily, dense underfur that felted perfectly into waterproof material. natural oils that gave finished hats their distinctive sheen. George Geyer, now the company's chief fur inspector, had learned to grade pelts according to criteria that European suppliers had never understood. Winter furs were superior to summer pelts. Mature animals produced better materials than young beavers. Specific regions within the Hudson Bay watershed yielded consistently higher quality products. This knowledge allowed the company to command premium prices for premium products, while maintaining strict quality controls that protected their reputation in European markets. But quality alone didn't explain their unprecedented profitability. The real secret was vertical integration that eliminated every layer of middleman costs between Hudson Bay hunters and London hat shops. Traditional fur trading required multiple intermediaries. Indigenous hunters sold to voyageurs. Voyageurs sold to trading posts sold to colonial merchants sold to transatlantic shipping companies. Shipping companies sold to European importers. European importers sold to manufacturers. Manufacturers sold to retailers. Each transaction added costs and reduced profits for original producers. The Hudson's Bay Company eliminated this entire chain. They purchased directly from indigenous hunters, transported furs in their own ships, processed materials in their own warehouses, and sold directly to hat manufacturers. Instead of sharing profits with dozens of intermediaries, they captured every penny of value creation from Hudson Bay to London retail markets. Their London warehouse had become the center of global beaver commerce. The company employed over 300 workers, sorting, grading, cleaning, and preparing pelts for auction. Master furriers from across Europe traveled to London specifically to bid on Hudson's Bay products. Single auction days generated revenue equivalent to $10 million in today's currency. Here's what made their monopoly unbreakable. They had perfected every aspect of beaver commerce while preventing competitors from learning their methods. Company trading protocols were industrial secrets, guarded more carefully than military plans. Traders signed contracts prohibiting them from working for competitors for 5 years after leaving company service. Factor promotion required oaths of permanent loyalty that carried criminal penalties for violations. Even ship captains were sworn to secrecy about navigation routes and trading post locations. The company had learned from Dutch East India Company mistakes in Asia. The VOC had allowed too much information to leak to English and French competitors, enabling rival companies to break their monopolies. Hudson's Bay directors were determined to prevent similar intelligence failures. But secrecy alone couldn't maintain their empire. They needed innovation that kept them ahead of any potential competition. The breakthrough came from James Knight's development of standardized trading protocols that maximized efficiency while maintaining indigenous relationships. Knight had studied successful trading systems throughout the world: Islamic bazaars, Chinese silk markets, African gold exchanges. He understood that sustainable commercial relationships required predictable procedures that all parties understood and trusted. The Hudson's Bay Company Trading Protocol became a masterpiece of commercial engineering. Indigenous hunters arriving at company posts followed established procedures that minimized disputes while maximizing transaction volume. First, ceremonial greetings that honored indigenous diplomatic traditions. Company factors participated in smoking rituals, gift exchanges, and formal speeches that demonstrated respect for indigenous sovereignty. These ceremonies took hours, but established the trust relationships that made large-scale commerce possible. Second, public display and evaluation of furs according to standardized quality criteria. Indigenous hunters understood exactly how company graders evaluated their pelts. They could observe the inspection process, ask questions about quality determinations, and request re-evaluation if they disagreed with initial assessments. Third, negotiated pricing based on published exchange rates that varied seasonally but followed predictable patterns. Indigenous traders knew what goods they could expect for specific fur quantities. Company factors couldn't cheat individual hunters without violating public agreements that would damage relationships with entire nations. Fourth, immediate delivery of trade goods from warehouse stocks that were visibly abundant and high quality. Indigenous hunters didn't have to worry about receiving inferior products or discovering that promised goods weren't available. The company maintained inventory levels that could handle large trading expeditions without shortages. This system eliminated the uncertainty and mistrust that plagued other colonial trading relationships. Indigenous hunters could plan their economic activities, knowing exactly what returns they would receive for their efforts. Company traders could predict seasonal fur volumes and plan their logistics accordingly. The result was unprecedented productivity throughout the Hudson Bay watershed. Indigenous hunting efficiency increased dramatically when hunters gained access to steel traps, firearms, and specialized tools that made beaver harvesting faster and more reliable. European trade goods didn't just provide convenience, they multiplied indigenous economic capacity in ways that benefited everyone involved in the system. But the company's masterstroke was developing year-round trading relationships that provided indigenous communities with economic security beyond seasonal fur sales. They established credit systems that allowed indigenous hunters to receive goods in spring and pay with furs during fall harvest seasons. They maintained emergency supplies of food and medicine that could sustain indigenous communities during difficult winters. They provided repair services for European tools and weapons that maintained their utility over years of hard use. These services created customer loyalty that no competitor could match. Indigenous nations weren't just selling furs to the Hudson's Bay Company. They were partners in economic relationships that enhanced their security, prosperity, and political independence. By 1695, the company was extracting over 100,000 beaver pelts annually from the Hudson Bay region, more than the rest of North America combined. Their London auctions set global fur prices that affected markets from Moscow to Montreal. European hat fashion responded to Hudson's Bay supply decisions made in wilderness trading posts that most consumers had never heard of. But this success created a problem that would eventually threaten their entire business model. Beaver populations throughout the Hudson Bay watershed were declining from intensive harvesting. The company's own success was destroying the resource base that made their monopoly possible. Indigenous hunters reported that beaver were becoming scarce in traditional hunting territories. Stream systems that had supported dozens of beaver families now contained only scattered individuals. The reproductive capacity of beaver populations was falling below harvest rates. George Geyer understood the implications immediately. If current harvesting continued, beaver populations would collapse within a generation. The company's monopoly would become worthless because there would be nothing left to monopolize. The solution required unprecedented cooperation between European commercial interests and indigenous conservation knowledge. Cree and Ojibwe nations had traditional wildlife management systems that maintained sustainable hunting levels across generations. They rotated hunting territories to allow animal populations to recover. They restricted harvesting during reproductive seasons. They maintained habitat conservation practices that protected the ecosystems that beaver populations required. The Hudson's Bay Company decided to incorporate indigenous conservation methods into their commercial operations. They negotiated agreements with indigenous nations that established seasonal hunting limitations, territorial rotation systems, and habitat protection requirements. This was revolutionary for its time. European commercial enterprises typically extracted resources as rapidly as possible without consideration for long-term sustainability. The Hudson's Bay Company chose reduced short-term profits in exchange for long-term monopoly preservation. But they were running out of time to implement conservation measures. French competition was intensifying throughout the region. American traders were pushing north from the Great Lakes. Russian fur companies were expanding eastward from Alaska. The Hudson's Bay Company's monopoly was about to face challenges from every direction. And beaver populations might not survive the competitive harvesting pressure that was coming. The company needed to find new revenue sources and new strategies that could maintain their dominance even if beaver became extinct. They were about to discover that controlling North American commerce required more than just controlling beaver populations. Chapter 6. American Pressure. The greatest threat to the Hudson's Bay Company wasn't coming from French soldiers or indigenous resistance. It was coming from American farmers with wagons full of manufactured goods. By 1790, the United States had transformed into an industrial powerhouse that could produce trade goods faster, cheaper, and in greater variety than anything England manufactured. American traders were pushing north from the Great Lakes with prices that the Hudson's Bay Company couldn't match and products that indigenous customers preferred. This wasn't just commercial competition, it was an existential challenge to the entire monopoly system that had made the company wealthy for over a century. The problem started with the American Revolution's unexpected consequences for North American fur trade. When the 13 colonies declared independence, the Hudson's Bay Company lost access to their most profitable markets in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. American merchants who had sold European goods in exchange for Hudson's Bay furs became competitors trying to establish their own trading networks, but the company didn't immediately understand how dangerous this competition would become. American traders weren't operating under royal charters that limited their territorial access. They weren't bound by diplomatic agreements with European powers that restricted their activities. They weren't required to maintain expensive fortifications or support military operations in distant wilderness regions. American companies could focus exclusively on commercial efficiency without the military and political obligations that consumed massive portions of Hudson's Bay Company profits. John Jacob Astor saw the opportunity first. The German immigrant had built America's first integrated fur trading empire by studying European monopoly systems and identifying their weaknesses. Astor understood that the Hudson's Bay Company's strength, their royal charter granting exclusive territorial control, was also their greatest vulnerability in a competitive marketplace. Astor's American Fur Company could operate anywhere they found profitable opportunities. They could establish trading posts in multiple regions simultaneously. They could abandon unprofitable territories without violating charter obligations. They could adapt to changing market conditions faster than any European monopoly corporation. But Astor's real innovation was understanding how American industrial development was changing the economics of North American trade. American textile mills were producing woolen goods that cost half as much as comparable English products. American iron foundries were manufacturing tools and weapons that indigenous customers found superior to European equivalents. American distilleries were creating whiskey that indigenous traders preferred to English rum. When American traders reached the Great Lakes region in the 1790s, they offered indigenous nations choices that hadn't existed during Hudson's Bay Company dominance. The impact on company operations was immediate and devastating. Indigenous traders who had dealt exclusively with Hudson's Bay posts for generations began comparing American and English trade goods. American blankets were warmer and more durable. American axes held their edge longer. American firearms required less maintenance and performed more reliably in harsh weather conditions. But the real competitive advantage was in American business practices that respected indigenous economic autonomy. American traders didn't demand exclusive territorial agreements. They didn't require indigenous nations to sever relationships with other trading companies. They didn't attempt to control indigenous political decisions or military alliances. They simply offered better products at lower prices and allowed market forces to determine trading relationships. This approach appealed strongly to indigenous nations who had grown tired of European attempts to manipulate their political and economic independence. The Hudson's Bay Company tried to respond with traditional monopoly tactics, lobbying the British government for military support to exclude American traders from regions covered by their royal charter. But the American Revolution had changed the political dynamics of North American commerce. Britain couldn't use military force to protect commercial monopolies without risking war with the United States. The Jay Treaty of 1794 specifically guaranteed American trading rights throughout the Great Lakes region. British officials told Hudson's Bay Company directors that they would have to compete commercially rather than relying on governmental protection. This was catastrophic news for a business model based on legal monopoly rather than competitive efficiency. Company trading posts throughout the southern edges of their territory began reporting dramatic revenue declines. Indigenous hunters were traveling hundreds of miles to trade with American posts rather than dealing with Hudson's Bay factors. Entire nations were shifting their trading relationships to American companies. The company's London directors faced a strategic crisis that threatened their entire North American operation. They could maintain their traditional monopoly approach in the remote Hudson Bay region, where American competition couldn't effectively reach. But that would mean abandoning the most profitable territories throughout the Great Lakes, Saskatchewan River, and Pacific Northwest regions. Alternatively, they could abandon their monopoly business model and compete directly with American companies using competitive pricing and improved customer service. But that would require fundamental changes to company culture and operations that had developed over 150 years. The decision to fight back commercially rather than retreat to Hudson Bay isolation came from William McGillivray, a young company director who had spent years studying American business methods. McGillivray understood that the Hudson's Bay Company possessed competitive advantages that American companies couldn't easily replicate. They had established relationships with indigenous nations that dated back generations. They had detailed geographic knowledge of vast wilderness territories that American traders were just beginning to explore. They had transportation networks and supply systems that could support commerce in regions where American companies had no infrastructure. The key was leveraging these advantages while adopting American innovations in customer service and product quality. The company began a complete overhaul of their trading practices. They negotiated new agreements with London manufacturers for improved trade goods that could compete with American products. They revised their pricing policies to match American offers while maintaining profitability through superior logistics efficiency. They modified their trading protocols to eliminate the bureaucratic procedures that indigenous customers found irritating. Most importantly, they began recruiting American traders who understood competitive marketplace dynamics. The Hudson's Bay Company offered higher salaries and better working conditions than American fur companies provided. They recruited experienced traders who brought detailed knowledge of American business methods and competitive strategies. They hired indigenous interpreters who understood both traditional trading relationships and modern commercial practices. This strategy worked brilliantly in regions where the company could deliver superior service. Their established transportation networks allowed them to maintain reliable supply schedules that American companies couldn't match. Their financial resources enabled them to extend credit terms that smaller competitors couldn't afford. Their political relationships with indigenous nations gave them access to prime hunting territories that American traders couldn't easily enter. But the competitive pressure was forcing fundamental changes in how the Hudson's Bay Company conducted business. They were no longer extracting monopoly profits from captive markets. They were earning competitive returns by providing superior value to customers who had multiple alternatives. Their business model was evolving from territorial control to service excellence. The transformation wasn't easy. Company shareholders complained about reduced profit margins. Long-serving factors struggled to adapt to customer-focused business practices. London directors found themselves managing a competitive enterprise rather than collecting monopoly rents. But the company survived the American challenge and emerged stronger in several crucial ways. They had developed business capabilities that didn't depend on governmental protection. They had learned to compete based on operational efficiency rather than legal privilege. They had built customer relationships based on mutual benefit rather than coercive monopoly control. These changes prepared the Hudson's Bay Company for even greater challenges that were coming from the Pacific Northwest. American settlers were crossing the continent in massive wagon trains, establishing communities throughout Oregon Territory and Washington Territory. The company's Pacific operations were about to face competition not just from American traders, but from American farmers, miners, and manufacturers who were building permanent settlements throughout their most profitable territories. The era of wilderness trading was ending. The Hudson's Bay Company would have to decide whether to evolve into a modern retail corporation or retreat to the Arctic regions where traditional fur trading might survive. But first, they had to deal with the most audacious takeover attempt in corporate history, a merger proposal that would either save the company or destroy it completely. Chapter 7. Merger Move. The proposal arrived at Hudson's Bay Company headquarters on a cold London morning in March 1821, and it changed everything. The Northwest Company, their most aggressive competitor, wasn't offering to surrender or negotiate territorial boundaries. They were proposing a complete merger that would create the largest commercial empire in human history. This wasn't a desperate move by a failing competitor. The Northwest Company controlled the most profitable fur trading territories in North America. They dominated the Pacific Northwest, the Rocky Mountains, and the Great Lakes region. Their annual revenues exceeded the Hudson's Bay Company's income by substantial margins. They were offering to merge because they had concluded that competitive warfare was destroying the profitability of North American fur trade for everyone involved. The fur wars had escalated beyond commercial competition into actual military conflict. Both companies were spending fortunes on private armies, fortified trading posts, and transportation networks that duplicated each other's infrastructure. Indigenous nations were being forced to choose sides in European corporate battles that offered them no benefits. Most damaging was the price warfare that was driving fur costs toward unsustainable levels. Competitive bidding for indigenous furs had increased purchasing costs by over 300% in 10 years. Both companies were offering trade goods worth more than the pelts they received. They were maintaining profitability only by cutting operational expenses, reducing factor salaries, eliminating post-maintenance, and abandoning customer service standards that had taken decades to develop. The Northwest Company's merger proposal was brutally simple. Combine operations to eliminate competitive costs, divide territories to end military conflicts, and restore monopoly pricing that would generate sustainable profits for both sets of shareholders. But the Hudson's Bay Company directors faced a fundamental problem. A merger with the Northwest Company would require surrendering the royal charter that had been the foundation of their business for 150 years. They would become minority shareholders in a new corporation dominated by Montreal merchants who had spent decades fighting against English commercial interests. The alternative was continuing competitive warfare that might destroy both companies within a few years. William Williams, the Hudson's Bay Company's chief negotiator, spent 6 months studying the Northwest Company's financial records, territorial operations, and management structure. What he discovered was both impressive and terrifying. The Northwest Company had solved logistical problems that had plagued Hudson's Bay operations for generations. They had developed overland transportation routes that could move large cargo loads across vast distances faster and cheaper than Hudson's Bay Company's ship-based systems. They had established trading relationships with indigenous nations throughout the Western Territories that the Hudson's Bay Company had never successfully penetrated. Most importantly, they had created management systems that operated efficiently across enormous distances without the centralized control that London headquarters tried to maintain over Hudson's Bay operations. The Northwest Company was organized as a partnership of experienced traders who shared ownership, profits, and decision-making authority. Partners understood local conditions because they lived and worked in North American wilderness rather than directing operations from London offices. They could respond quickly to changing market conditions, competitive threats, and indigenous political developments. Here's what Williams realized. The Northwest Company had evolved beyond the colonial business model that still characterized Hudson's Bay Company operations. They had become a genuinely North American corporation that understood continental commerce better than any European company. But they had also identified crucial weaknesses in Northwest Company operations that a merger could address. The Northwest Company lacked the Hudson's Bay Company's established relationships with London financial markets. They couldn't access the investment capital required for major expansion or sustained competitive warfare. Their partnership structure made long-term strategic planning difficult because partners prioritized short-term profits over long-term market development. Most critically, they had no legal monopoly protections. American companies could enter their territories without violating governmental agreements. British military support wasn't available for protecting their trading posts or transportation routes. A merger would combine Northwest Company operational excellence with Hudson's Bay Company financial resources and legal protections. The negotiations were extraordinarily complex because they involved not just commercial terms, but political relationships that affected British-American diplomacy, indigenous sovereignty, and colonial development throughout Western North America. The British government had strategic interests in maintaining English commercial control over territories that might become American states. The Hudson's Bay Company's Royal Charter provided legal justification for British territorial claims that would be lost if the company disappeared. But government officials also understood that the company's continued existence depended on commercial viability rather than legal protection. If competitive pressure destroyed Hudson's Bay profitability, the Royal Charter would become meaningless regardless of its legal status. The solution required unprecedented cooperation between British government officials and Canadian business leaders. The merger agreement created a new Hudson's Bay Company that maintained the legal framework of the original Royal Charter while adopting the operational methods that had made the Northwest Company successful. London headquarters retained ultimate authority over strategic decisions, but North American operations gained substantial autonomy over day-to-day business activities. The partnership structure was preserved for field operations while corporate governance remained centered in England. Most importantly, the new company gained exclusive control over all fur trading territories, from Hudson Bay to the Pacific Ocean and from the Arctic to the American border. This was the largest corporate monopoly in world history, a single company controlling commerce across 3 million square miles of territory. But the merger also created enormous management challenges that nearly destroyed the combined enterprise. Integrating two companies with different corporate cultures, operational procedures, and employee loyalty systems required years of careful planning and diplomatic negotiation. Northwest Company partners resented subordination to London directors who had never experienced North American wilderness conditions. Hudson's Bay Company factors struggled to adapt to competitive business practices that emphasized customer service over bureaucratic compliance. The process was further complicated by indigenous nations who had developed different relationships with each company and weren't automatically willing to accept the merger arrangements. George Simpson, appointed as the new company's North American governor, spent 5 years traveling throughout the merged territories, negotiating new agreements with indigenous nations, consolidating redundant operations, and establishing unified business procedures. Simpson understood that the merger's success depended on creating operational efficiency that could maintain profitability even as American competition continued expanding into company territories. He closed unprofitable trading posts, consolidated transportation routes, and standardized trading procedures across all company operations. He negotiated new agreements with indigenous nations that respected traditional relationships while establishing consistent commercial terms throughout the enlarged territory. Most importantly, he recruited and promoted employees based on performance rather than company loyalty or ethnic background. The result was a transformed Hudson's Bay Company that operated more efficiently than either predecessor corporation. By 1825, the merged company was generating profits that exceeded the combined revenues of both original companies while serving customers better than either had managed independently. But the merger had also attracted attention from American political leaders who viewed the enlarged Hudson's Bay Company as a threat to United States territorial expansion. American newspapers described the company as a British commercial empire that was preventing American settlement throughout the Pacific Northwest. Congressional leaders demanded that the U.S. government take action to break the company's monopoly control over Western territories that might become American states. The merger had saved the Hudson's Bay Company from competitive destruction, but it had also made them a target for American political pressure that would ultimately prove more dangerous than commercial competition. The company now controlled more territory than any corporation in history. But they were about to discover that territorial control meant nothing if the governments that recognized it lacked the power to enforce it. The final battle for Hudson's Bay Company survival wouldn't be fought in wilderness trading posts or London boardrooms. It would be fought in the diplomatic negotiations that determined whether British or American law would govern the future of Western North America. Chapter 8. Modern Decline. The beginning of the end came disguised as the company's greatest triumph. In 1849, Vancouver Island was granted to the Hudson's Bay Company as a crown colony, making them not just traders, but the actual government of British territory on the Pacific coast. They controlled customs, collected taxes, maintained law and order, and granted land to settlers. This was colonial power beyond anything they had achieved in Hudson Bay. But it was also a trap that would ultimately destroy their monopoly forever. The discovery of gold in the Fraser River in 1858 brought 30,000 American prospectors flooding into company territory within 6 months. These weren't traders seeking commercial relationships. They were settlers demanding American-style property rights, democratic government, and free market competition. James Douglas, serving simultaneously as Hudson's Bay Company chief factor and colonial governor, faced an impossible situation. The company's monopoly charter required him to exclude competitors and maintain exclusive trading rights. His governmental responsibilities required him to serve the interests of settlers who viewed company monopolies as illegal restraints on free commerce. The conflict exposed a fundamental contradiction that had always existed within the Hudson's Bay Company system, but had never been tested at this scale. The company claimed to own territory through royal charter, but they had never actually governed the people living within that territory. Indigenous nations maintained their traditional political systems. The few European settlers accepted company authority because they depended on company services for survival. But thousands of American miners and farmers weren't dependent on company services. They brought their own tools, established their own supply networks, and expected their own democratic institutions. They viewed Hudson's Bay Company authority as an illegitimate obstacle to their pursuit of economic opportunity. The company tried to handle the crisis using traditional methods: legal challenges based on charter rights, appeals to British government for military support, and diplomatic negotiations with American officials to limit immigration. None of these approaches worked against the reality of American expansion. American settlers simply ignored company legal claims. They established their own mining districts with elected governments that enforced American property law. They organized supply companies that competed directly with company trading posts. They demanded that British officials choose between supporting company monopolies or accommodating settler demands for representative government. The British government chose the settlers. The Colonial Office concluded that maintaining Hudson's Bay Company monopolies was less important than preventing American annexation of British territories. If company authority caused American settlers to demand political union with the United States, Britain would lose the entire Pacific Northwest. In 1858, the British government revoked company governmental authority over Vancouver Island and established Crown Colony administration under officials who reported directly to London rather than to company headquarters. This was the beginning of a systematic dismantling of Hudson's Bay Company territorial control that would continue for the next 20 years. The company's directors understood the implications immediately. If British officials would sacrifice company charter rights to maintain colonial peace, the entire monopoly system was vulnerable to political pressure rather than legal protection. They began a desperate campaign to modernize their business model before territorial control disappeared completely. The transformation strategy was revolutionary for a company that had operated as a territorial monopoly for nearly 2 centuries. They would abandon exclusive trading rights in exchange for becoming the dominant retail corporation throughout Western North America. This required fundamental changes in almost every aspect of company operations. Instead of excluding competitors, they would compete based on superior customer service, better product selection, and more convenient store locations. Instead of controlling territory, they would control market share through operational efficiency. Instead of extracting monopoly profits from captive customers, they would earn competitive returns by providing superior value. The company began establishing retail stores throughout growing communities in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. These weren't traditional trading posts designed for wilderness commerce. They were modern department stores that served the needs of settled communities. Company stores sold everything frontier families required: food supplies, household goods, farming tools, construction materials, clothing, and luxury items that demonstrated prosperity and social status. They provided credit terms that allowed settlers to purchase expensive items like stoves or furniture while paying over time from agricultural income. Most importantly, they offered customer service standards that rural communities couldn't obtain from mail-order companies or traveling merchants. But this retail transformation required enormous capital investments that strained company financial resources. Each new store required inventory worth thousands of pounds, building construction or rental costs, staff salaries, and transportation networks that could maintain reliable supply schedules. The company was investing in hundreds of retail locations simultaneously, while their territorial monopolies were generating declining revenues. The financial pressure was compounded by changes in global fashion that were reducing demand for beaver felt hats. Silk hats had become fashionable among European upper classes who had previously driven beaver fur demand. Improved manufacturing techniques had made silk hats cheaper to produce and more comfortable to wear than heavy fur products. The market that had sustained Hudson's Bay Company profitability for 2 centuries was disappearing. Company directors faced a strategic crisis that threatened their survival. They were investing in retail transformation while their traditional revenue sources collapsed. The solution came from an unexpected source: the Canadian government. Confederation in 1867 had created a new nation that needed to assert sovereignty over Western territories to prevent American expansion. But the Canadian government lacked the financial resources and administrative capacity to govern the vast Hudson's Bay Company territories. The Rupert's Land Act of 1870 provided a solution that served both Canadian political needs and company financial requirements. Canada purchased Hudson's Bay Company territorial rights for $300,000 plus substantial land grants that could be sold to settlers or developed for agricultural purposes. The company retained ownership of their trading posts, retail stores, and transportation networks while surrendering governmental authority to Canadian officials. This sale provided the capital that enabled successful retail expansion throughout Western Canada. But it also marked the formal end of the Hudson's Bay Company's existence as a territorial monopoly. They were now a retail corporation, competing in open markets against Canadian and American companies that offered similar products and services. The transition was remarkably successful. By 1885, the Hudson's Bay Company operated over 300 retail stores throughout Western Canada, making them one of the largest retail corporations in the British Empire. Their annual revenues exceeded their peak fur trading profits. They employed thousands of people and served hundreds of communities that hadn't existed during their monopoly period. But they had also lost the unique strategic position that had made them one of the most powerful corporations in world history. The company that had once controlled 15% of North America had become a successful but ordinary retail business. They competed based on customer satisfaction rather than legal privilege. They earned profits through operational efficiency rather than monopoly extraction. The transformation was complete, but it was also profound. The Hudson's Bay Company had successfully evolved from a colonial monopoly to a modern corporation, but they had also surrendered the territorial empire that had defined their identity for over 2 centuries. By 1890, few Canadians understood that their neighborhood department store had once been the government of half a continent. The Hudson's Bay Company had become so thoroughly integrated into Canadian commercial life that their extraordinary history was largely forgotten. But the legacy of their territorial monopoly would continue shaping Canadian development for generations. The trading posts they had established became towns and cities. The transportation routes they had developed became railways and highways. The relationships they had built with indigenous nations became the foundation for modern treaty negotiations. The Hudson's Bay Company had evolved from empire to enterprise, but they had left an indelible mark on the geography, economy, and culture of North America. Chapter 9. Canadian Legacy Today. If you walk down any main street in Western Canada, you'll see the Hudson's Bay Company's legacy everywhere, even though most people have no idea they're looking at the remnants of a continental empire. Those red and white striped blankets displayed in store windows, they're based on the original Hudson's Bay point blankets that became the unofficial currency of North American fur trade. The downtown department store with the simple Bay logo? It's part of the same company that once owned territory larger than India. The street names, York, Albany, Churchill, commemorate trading posts that served as capitals of a wilderness empire. But the most profound legacy isn't visible in stores or street signs. It's embedded in the fundamental structure of Canadian Confederation itself. The Hudson's Bay Company's territorial monopoly created the geographic foundation that made Canadian nationhood possible. Without company control over Western territories, the region would likely have become part of the United States during the 19th century American expansion. The company's trading post network provided the infrastructure that enabled Canadian settlement and development. Their relationships with Indigenous nations established precedents for treaty negotiations that continue shaping Canadian law today. This isn't just historical curiosity. It's living reality that affects contemporary Canadian politics, economics, and culture. The Hudson's Bay Company operated under fundamentally different principles than the American colonial enterprises that shaped United States development. American expansion was based on individual property ownership, democratic government, and competitive free markets. Hudson's Bay Company expansion was based on corporate monopolies, appointed governance, and controlled economic relationships. These different approaches created different national cultures that persist today. Canadian acceptance of government-controlled industries, regulated markets, and centralized economic planning reflects the Hudson's Bay Company model that dominated Canadian development for over 2 centuries. American emphasis on individual entrepreneurship, competitive markets, and limited government reflects the colonial experiences that shaped United States political culture. The comparison becomes clear when you examine how each nation developed transcontinental transportation systems. The United States built transcontinental railroads through competitive private companies that raced to complete construction and maximize profits. The Canadian Pacific Railway was built through government coordination, monopoly grants, and careful integration with existing Hudson's Bay Company transportation networks. Both approaches succeeded in creating transcontinental nations, but they created different expectations about the role of government and corporations in national development. The Hudson's Bay Company also established patterns of Indigenous relations that distinguish Canadian policy from American approaches. The company's survival depended on maintaining cooperative relationships with Indigenous nations who controlled the territories where trading occurred. Company success required respecting Indigenous sovereignty, honoring treaty obligations, and providing economic benefits that made partnerships attractive to Indigenous leaders. This tradition influenced Canadian treaty-making processes that attempted to balance Indigenous rights with settler development needs. While these efforts were often inadequate and sometimes completely failed, the underlying principle of negotiated relationships rather than military conquest became embedded in Canadian legal and political culture. American Western expansion followed different patterns based on military conquest, territorial displacement, and reservation systems that separated Indigenous nations from settler development. Again, both approaches involved enormous injustices and cultural destruction, but they created different legal frameworks and political relationships that continue affecting contemporary Indigenous rights and governmental policies. The Hudson's Bay Company's commercial legacy is equally significant, but more complex. The company's monopoly control over Western Canadian development created economic patterns that persist in modern Canadian business culture. Large integrated corporations with close government relationships dominate Canadian industries like banking, telecommunications, and natural resources. Government regulation and coordination plays a larger role in Canadian economic development than in comparable American industries. These patterns reflect the Hudson's Bay Company model of controlled development that prioritized stability and coordination over competitive innovation. But the company also demonstrated that successful business requires adaptation to changing conditions rather than dependence on legal protection. The Hudson's Bay Company survived the end of their monopoly by transforming their business model, improving their customer service, and competing based on operational excellence. They showed that companies with long historical traditions could evolve to meet contemporary market demands without losing their core identity. This lesson became particularly relevant during the 20th century when Canadian businesses faced increasing competition from American and international corporations. The Hudson's Bay Company's retail transformation provided a template for other Canadian companies that needed to modernize while maintaining their distinctive Canadian character. Today, the Hudson's Bay Company operates as Hudson's Bay, Canada's oldest corporation and one of North America's largest retail chains. They run department stores throughout Canada and the northern United States. They've expanded into e-commerce, real estate development and international retail partnerships. But they've also maintained connections to their historical identity that distinguish them from purely commercial retail corporations. Hudson's Bay stores still sell point blankets manufactured according to 18th century specifications. Their corporate museum preserves artifacts and documents from their territorial empire period. Their corporate culture emphasizes long-term relationships and community involvement rather than quarterly profit maximization. The company has also acknowledged the problematic aspects of their historical operations. Modern Hudson's Bay recognizes that their monopoly control often exploited indigenous nations and restricted economic opportunities for settlers. They've participated in truth and reconciliation processes that examine how colonial companies contributed to cultural destruction and economic displacement. They've established partnerships with indigenous businesses and cultural organizations that attempt to address some of the historical injustices associated with their territorial empire. These efforts don't erase the negative consequences of monopoly control, but they demonstrate that historical responsibility can be acknowledged while maintaining business continuity. The broader lesson concerns how nations and institutions handle the legacy of problematic but formative historical experiences. The Hudson's Bay Company's territorial empire was both the foundation of Canadian development and a system that caused enormous harm to Indigenous peoples and limited opportunities for non-Indigenous settlers. Understanding this complexity is essential for understanding modern Canada's ongoing struggles with Indigenous relations, regional development, and national identity. Similarly, the company's business evolution demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of institutional adaptation. The Hudson's Bay Company successfully transformed from a territorial monopoly to a competitive retail corporation, but they also lost the unique strategic position that had made them extraordinarily powerful. They gained democratic legitimacy and competitive efficiency, but they surrendered the ability to shape continental development according to their institutional vision. This trade-off reflects broader questions about corporate power, governmental authority, and economic development that remain relevant in contemporary debates about globalization, regulation, and national sovereignty. The Hudson's Bay Company's story suggests that institutional power is always temporary, but institutional influence can persist long after power disappears. The company's territorial empire ended over 150 years ago, but their impact on Canadian geography, culture, and political development continues shaping national life today. Whether that influence has been beneficial or harmful depends on your perspective and priorities, but it's certainly been profound and enduring. The company that once controlled 15% of North America now operates retail stores and e-commerce platforms, but their transformation from empire to enterprise tells a larger story about how nations develop, how institutions evolve, and how historical experiences create contemporary realities. The physical infrastructure that the Hudson's Bay Company built across Western Canada became the skeleton around which modern Canadian cities developed. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of careful strategic planning that recognized how commercial networks could evolve into permanent settlement patterns. Fort Garry, established in 1822 at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, became the heart of what is now Winnipeg, Manitoba's capital city and Canada's 7th largest metropolitan area. The company's original fort walls are gone, but the street grid they established still defines downtown Winnipeg's layout. The main street that connected Fort Garry to the Red River docks remains Winnipeg's primary commercial corridor nearly 2 centuries later. Calgary emerged from Fort Calgary, built in 1875 where the Bow and Elbow rivers meet. The company chose this location because it controlled transportation routes between the northern prairies and the Rocky Mountain passes. Today, Calgary is Canada's 4th largest city and the center of the nation's energy industry. The rivers that made it strategically valuable for fur trading now provide recreational amenities for over 1.3 million residents. Edmonton developed around Fort Edmonton, established in 1795 along the North Saskatchewan River. The company positioned this fort to control the northern fur trading routes while providing access to both prairie and boreal forest territories. Modern Edmonton has become Alberta's capital and Canada's sixth largest metropolitan area, with an economy based on government services, education, and energy production. Vancouver's story is more complex because the Hudson's Bay Company operated Fort Langley, 30 miles upriver from where the modern city eventually developed. But company surveyors identified Burrard Inlet as the ideal location for a Pacific port that could connect Canadian transcontinental railways to Asian markets. When the Canadian Pacific Railway reached the coast in 1887, they built their terminus where company officials had recommended, creating the foundation for Vancouver's emergence as Canada's third largest city. These weren't random choices that accidentally became successful cities. The Hudson's Bay Company developed sophisticated criteria for evaluating strategic locations based on transportation access, natural resources, defensive positions, and economic potential. Company factors understood that successful trading posts required reliable water transportation, adequate timber supplies, defensible terrain, and proximity to indigenous communities who would provide both customers and security partners. These same criteria proved essential for successful urban development as Canada evolved from a wilderness territory to a modern nation. The company's transportation networks became even more influential than their urban planning. The York boat routes that connected Hudson Bay to the western interior became the basis for Canada's first transcontinental transportation system. Company surveyors had identified the most efficient water routes across the Canadian Shield, the easiest portages around major rapids, and the safest harbors for supply depot locations. When Canadian government officials began planning transcontinental railroad construction in the 1870s, they relied heavily on Hudson's Bay Company geographic knowledge accumulated over 2 centuries of wilderness operations. The Canadian Pacific Railway followed company-identified routes through much of northwestern Ontario and across the prairies. The Canadian National Railway System incorporated dozens of abandoned company trading posts as station locations. Modern highway systems show similar Hudson's Bay Company influence. The Trans-Canada Highway follows company transportation corridors across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Provincial highways throughout Western Canada connect cities that began as company trading posts, using routes that company voyageurs had established for canoe and York boat transportation. This infrastructure legacy created path-dependent development patterns that continue shaping contemporary Canadian economics and politics. Western Canadian cities developed along company-identified transportation corridors rather than following the geometric grid patterns that characterized American urban development. Canadian cities tend to follow river valleys and natural transportation routes, creating more organic urban forms, but also limiting expansion options in ways that affect modern housing costs and economic development. The regional economic specialization that characterizes modern Canada also reflects Hudson's Bay Company territorial organization. The company divided their territory into geographic departments based on natural resource availability and transportation logistics. The York Factory Department controlled the Hudson Bay coast and northern Manitoba. The Saskatchewan Department managed the prairie regions. The Columbia Department governed the Pacific Northwest. The Mackenzie River Department administered the Arctic territories. These administrative divisions recognized that different regions had different economic potentials and required different development strategies. The company adapted their operations to regional conditions rather than imposing uniform policies across their entire territory. Modern Canadian federalism reflects similar recognition that regional diversity requires flexible governmental approaches. Provincial governments control natural resource development, education policy, and healthcare delivery because Canadian political culture accepts that different regions have different needs and priorities. American federalism tends toward more uniform national policies because American development followed more standardized patterns of territorial expansion and settlement. The Hudson's Bay Company's relationship with indigenous nations created legal and political precedents that continue influencing contemporary Canadian approaches to Indigenous rights and sovereignty. Understanding this legacy requires examining both the innovations and limitations of company Indigenous policies. The company's most significant innovation was recognizing Indigenous nations as sovereign political entities rather than colonial subjects or economic resources. This recognition was pragmatic rather than ideological. The company needed Indigenous cooperation to operate successfully in territories where Indigenous nations maintained political and military control. But pragmatic recognition still required formal diplomatic relationships that acknowledged Indigenous political authority. Company officials participated in traditional Indigenous political protocols, including ceremonial meetings, gift exchanges, and consensus-building discussions that could take weeks to complete. They learned Indigenous languages, respected Indigenous legal systems, and honored Indigenous territorial boundaries. Most importantly, they negotiated formal agreements that both Indigenous nations and company officials understood to be binding international treaties between sovereign entities. The Treaty of Albany, negotiated between the Hudson's Bay Company and the Cree Confederation in 1684, established principles that influenced Canadian treaty-making for over 2 centuries. The treaty recognized Cree territorial sovereignty while granting company trading rights within specific geographic boundaries. It required company traders to respect Cree hunting regulations and seasonal migration patterns. It established dispute resolution procedures based on Indigenous legal traditions. The Treaty of Churchill, signed with Inuit leaders in 1717, created similar frameworks for company operations in Arctic territories. It recognized Inuit sovereignty over marine resources while allowing company access to coastal trading locations. It required company factors to provide emergency assistance to Inuit communities during harsh winters. It established protocols for resolving conflicts between company employees and Inuit hunters. These agreements differed fundamentally from the land cession treaties that characterized European colonization elsewhere in North America. Hudson's Bay Company treaties didn't require Indigenous nations to surrender territorial sovereignty or relocate to designated reservations. They created frameworks for shared territorial use that preserved Indigenous political independence while enabling European commercial activities. The legal principles embedded in these treaties became foundations for modern Canadian approaches to Indigenous rights. The Constitution Act of 1982 recognizes existing Aboriginal and treaty rights as fundamental constitutional principles. Supreme Court of Canada decisions consistently reference Hudson's Bay Company-era treaties as evidence of Indigenous sovereignty that was never extinguished through conquest or cession. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada endorsed in 2016, reflects similar principles of Indigenous sovereignty and shared territorial governance that the Hudson's Bay Company developed through practical necessity. But the company's Indigenous legacy also includes problematic elements that continue affecting contemporary Indigenous communities. Company trading relationships created economic dependencies that undermined traditional Indigenous economic systems. Indigenous communities that became heavily involved in fur trading often abandoned traditional subsistence activities, making them vulnerable to market fluctuations and resource depletion beyond their control. The company's credit system, while more flexible than European commercial practices, still created debt relationships that could force Indigenous hunters to continue trading even when fur prices were unfavorable. Indigenous families sometimes found themselves trapped in cycles of debt that prevented them from returning to traditional economic activities. Most damaging was the company's role in introducing European diseases, alcohol, and manufactured goods that disrupted traditional Indigenous social systems. Company traders understood that alcohol could be used to manipulate trading relationships and gain advantages in negotiations with Indigenous leaders. While official company policy discouraged excessive alcohol trade, individual factors often ignored these restrictions when competitive pressure from French or American traders threatened their market share. European manufactured goods gradually replaced traditional Indigenous technologies, in ways that reduced indigenous communities' self-sufficiency. Metal tools, firearms, and woolen clothing provided immediate advantages, but required continued access to European suppliers for maintenance and replacement. These dependencies became particularly problematic when the company's monopoly ended and competitive trading gave way to Canadian government administration of Indigenous affairs. The Indian Act of 1876 imposed legal frameworks that were completely different from the treaty relationships that Indigenous nations had developed with the Hudson's Bay Company. Instead of sovereign-to-sovereign agreements, the Indian Act created ward-guardian relationships that denied Indigenous political autonomy and imposed European legal systems on Indigenous communities. This transition from company treaty relationships to government administration represents one of the most damaging aspects of Canadian colonial history. Indigenous leaders who had negotiated successfully with company officials for generations suddenly found themselves dealing with government bureaucrats who had no understanding of Indigenous political systems or legal traditions. Treaties that had functioned effectively for over a century were ignored or reinterpreted according to European legal concepts that negated Indigenous sovereignty. The residential school system that caused enormous cultural damage throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries was fundamentally inconsistent with Hudson's Bay Company approaches to Indigenous relations. Company survival had required respecting Indigenous cultural autonomy and maintaining cooperative relationships with Indigenous political leaders. Company traders learned Indigenous languages, participated in Indigenous ceremonies, and adapted European practices to Indigenous cultural norms. Government assimilation policies tried to destroy Indigenous cultures and replace them with European alternatives. This approach contradicted 2 centuries of successful company-Indigenous cooperation based on mutual respect and cultural accommodation. Contemporary Indigenous rights movements often reference Hudson's Bay Company-era treaties as evidence that respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments are possible when both parties recognize each other's sovereignty and legitimate interests. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's calls to action specifically reference the need to return to nation-to-nation relationships based on respect, cooperation, and partnership rather than the colonial administration that characterized 20th century government policies. This represents a partial return to Hudson's Bay Company principles of Indigenous relations, adapted for contemporary political and legal contexts. Modern land claims negotiations, co-management agreements for natural resources, and Indigenous self-government initiatives all reflect elements of the treaty relationships that the Hudson's Bay Company pioneered during their territorial period. But these contemporary initiatives also attempt to address the economic and cultural damage caused by colonial policies that replaced company approaches to Indigenous relations. The Hudson's Bay Company's business model created expectations about corporate-government relationships that continue distinguishing Canadian capitalism from American free market approaches. Understanding this legacy requires examining how the company's monopoly operations influenced broader Canadian attitudes toward corporate regulation and government economic intervention. The company operated as what economists now call a crown corporation, a private enterprise with exclusive government-granted privileges that required it to serve public policy objectives as well as shareholder interests. This hybrid model became a template for Canadian economic development that persists today. Canadian National Railway, created in 1919, followed the Hudson's Bay Company model of government-chartered monopoly designed to serve national development goals that private competition couldn't achieve. The CNR received exclusive operating rights over specific routes in exchange for providing transportation services to remote communities that weren't commercially viable. Air Canada, established in 1937, operated under similar principles as a government-chartered airline with exclusive rights to specific international routes in exchange for providing domestic air service to small communities throughout northern and western Canada. CBC Radio Canada, founded in 1936, received monopoly broadcasting privileges in exchange for providing programming in both official languages and serving communities that commercial broadcasters found unprofitable. These crown corporations reflected the Hudson's Bay Company principle that private enterprises could serve public interests more effectively than either pure government administration or unregulated competitive markets. The model assumes that exclusive operating rights provide sufficient revenue to cross-subsidize unprofitable but socially necessary services. Companies serve remote communities or provide expensive services because their monopoly privileges in profitable markets generate the revenue needed to support their broader public obligations. This approach contrasts sharply with American economic policies that generally rely on government subsidies or regulatory mandates to achieve public policy objectives through private enterprise. American railroads, airlines, and broadcasters operate in competitive markets, but receive direct government subsidies or tax incentives to serve public interests. American economic policy tends to separate profit-maximizing business activities from public service obligations rather than integrating them within single enterprises. The Hudson's Bay Company legacy also influences Canadian attitudes toward corporate regulation and market concentration. Canadians generally accept higher levels of corporate concentration and government regulation than Americans find politically acceptable. Canadian banking, telecommunications, and energy industries are dominated by small numbers of large integrated corporations that would likely face antitrust challenges in the United States. Royal Bank of Canada, Toronto Dominion Bank, Bank of Nova Scotia, Bank of Montreal, and Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce control over 80% of Canadian banking assets. This concentration would be considered oligopolistic in American markets, but Canadians accept it because these banks provide stable financial services and support Canadian economic development in ways that smaller competitive banks might not achieve. Similar patterns characterize Canadian telecommunications, where three companies, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, control most wireless and internet services, and Canadian Energy, where government-owned utilities dominate electricity generation and distribution in most provinces. This regulatory approach reflects Hudson's Bay Company precedents that evaluated corporate behavior based on territorial development and public service rather than pure market efficiency. The company's monopoly was considered legitimate as long as it provided reliable trading services, maintained peaceful indigenous relations, and supported British territorial claims. Government officials didn't evaluate the company's performance based on competitive pricing or market innovation. They measured success based on territorial control and political stability. Modern Canadian regulatory agencies follow similar principles when evaluating telecommunications mergers, banking consolidation, and energy sector concentration. They focus on ensuring adequate service delivery and supporting national economic objectives rather than maximizing competitive market outcomes. But the Hudson's Bay Company legacy also includes skepticism about unregulated corporate power that distinguishes Canadian political culture from American business-friendly attitudes. The company's territorial monopoly demonstrated both the benefits and dangers of concentrated corporate authority. Company control enabled efficient economic development and peaceful territorial administration, but it also restricted individual economic opportunities and limited democratic governance. Canadian political culture retains wariness about corporate power that requires active government oversight and regulation to serve public interests. Americans tend to trust market forces to limit corporate power through competitive pressure, while Canadians expect government intervention to ensure that corporate behavior serves broader social objectives. This difference becomes apparent in contemporary debates about technology company regulation, environmental protection, and social media governance. Canadian governments have been more willing to regulate technology companies, impose carbon pricing systems, and restrict corporate political activities than American governments have attempted. Canadian voters generally support these interventions as necessary protections against corporate power, while American voters often view similar policies as government overreach that restricts business freedom. The Hudson's Bay Company's legacy suggests that these different attitudes reflect different historical experiences with corporate-government relationships rather than fundamental ideological differences about capitalism or democracy. Canadians developed within institutional frameworks where corporate power was always subject to government oversight and public service obligations. Americans developed within competitive market systems where corporate power was limited primarily through market competition rather than regulatory constraint. Both approaches have created successful economic systems, but they operate according to different assumptions about the proper relationship between private enterprise and public authority. Understanding these differences helps explain why Canadian and American responses to contemporary economic challenges often diverge, despite shared democratic values and similar market economies. The Hudson's Bay Company's territorial empire created institutional precedents that continue influencing how Canadians think about corporate responsibility, government regulation, and economic development. These precedents don't determine contemporary policy choices, but they provide cultural frameworks that shape how Canadians evaluate corporate behavior and government economic intervention. The Hudson's Bay Company's 200-year territorial monopoly provides crucial insights into how corporate power operates in the contemporary global economy. Their experience demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of concentrated corporate control that remain relevant for understanding modern multinational corporations, technology platforms, and global supply chains. The company's monopoly succeeded because it combined legal protection with operational excellence in ways that created sustainable competitive advantages. Their royal charter provided exclusive territorial rights, but maintaining those rights required constant innovation, customer service, and adaptation to changing market conditions. This combination of legal privilege and operational performance offers important lessons for contemporary debates about corporate regulation and antitrust policy. Modern technology companies often achieve market dominance through network effects and platform advantages that function similarly to the Hudson's Bay Company's territorial monopoly. Google controls over 90% of global internet search traffic. Facebook's family of platforms reaches over 3 billion users worldwide. Amazon dominates e-commerce and cloud computing services that millions of businesses depend on. These companies don't possess formal government charters granting exclusive territorial rights, but they exercise market power that approaches monopoly control within their respective domains. Like the Hudson's Bay Company, technology platforms succeed because they provide services that customers value more than competitive alternatives. Google's search algorithms deliver more relevant results than competing services. Facebook's social networks connect people more effectively than alternative platforms. Amazon's logistics systems provide faster, cheaper delivery than most retail competitors. But also like the Hudson's Bay Company, these platforms use their market dominance to exclude competitors and extract monopoly profits that might not be sustainable in truly competitive markets. The Hudson's Bay Company's experience suggests that sustainable monopoly power requires continuous innovation and customer satisfaction rather than just legal protection or market dominance. When the company became complacent about customer service or innovation, they faced successful challenges from French traders, American companies, and indigenous nations who found better alternatives. Their monopoly survived only as long as they provided superior value to all stakeholders: customers, suppliers, government officials, and territorial communities. Contemporary technology companies face similar pressures despite their apparent market dominance. Google's search monopoly could be challenged by artificial intelligence systems that provide better results. Facebook's social media dominance could be undermined by new platforms that offer superior user experiences. Amazon's e-commerce leadership could be threatened by companies that develop more efficient logistics systems. The Hudson's Bay Company's territorial empire also demonstrates how monopoly control can become a liability when economic and political conditions change. The company's success during the fur trading era became a disadvantage when North American development shifted toward agricultural settlement and industrial production. Their territorial monopoly prevented competitors from entering their markets, but it also prevented them from adapting quickly to changing customer needs and economic opportunities. By the time competitive pressure forced them to modernize their business model, they had lost crucial decades of innovation and market development that might have enabled more successful adaptation. Contemporary monopoly companies risk similar obsolescence if they become too dependent on their current market positions rather than continuing to innovate and adapt to changing conditions. The Hudson's Bay Company's relationship with indigenous nations also provides insights into how global corporations can manage relationships with local communities and governments throughout their operational territories. The company's success required maintaining cooperative relationships with dozens of sovereign indigenous nations who controlled the territories where trading occurred. This required understanding local political systems, respecting cultural differences, and providing economic benefits that made partnership attractive to local leaders. Modern multinational corporations face similar challenges when operating across multiple countries with different legal systems, cultural norms, and political expectations. Successful global companies generally adopt the Hudson's Bay Company approach of adapting their operations to local conditions while maintaining consistent corporate standards and objectives. They respect local political autonomy while building economic relationships that benefit both corporate shareholders and local communities. Companies that try to impose uniform corporate policies without accommodation to local conditions often face resistance that threatens their long-term operational success. The Hudson's Bay Company's territorial empire ended when they could no longer provide sufficient value to their stakeholders to justify their monopoly privileges. British government officials concluded that company monopoly control was preventing territorial development that served broader national interests. Contemporary antitrust policy faces similar questions about when corporate market dominance serves public interests and when it becomes harmful to economic innovation and consumer welfare. The Hudson's Bay Company's experience suggests that monopoly power becomes problematic when it's used to extract value rather than create value for stakeholders beyond corporate shareholders. The company's territorial monopoly was sustainable when it provided superior trading services, maintained peaceful territorial administration, and supported economic development that benefited indigenous nations, settlers, and government officials. Their monopoly became unsustainable when competitive pressure demonstrated that alternative arrangements could provide better services at lower costs. Modern antitrust policy could benefit from similar focus on whether corporate market dominance creates or destroys value for consumers, suppliers, workers, and broader communities, rather than focusing primarily on competitive market structure. The Hudson's Bay Company also demonstrated that successful long-term corporate strategy requires balancing short-term profit maximization with sustainable stakeholder relationships. The company survived competitive challenges and political pressure for over 2 centuries because they invested in infrastructure, community relationships, and employee development that created long-term competitive advantages rather than just quarterly profit maximization. Contemporary corporations that prioritize short-term shareholder returns over long-term stakeholder value often face the same challenges that destroyed many of the Hudson's Bay Company's competitors. They sacrifice sustainable competitive advantages for immediate financial gains that prove temporary. The Hudson's Bay Company's transformation from territorial monopoly to competitive retailer demonstrates that corporate survival requires continuous adaptation rather than dependence on historical advantages or market position. Companies that successfully navigate major disruptions to their business models typically do so by maintaining their core competencies while developing new capabilities that serve changing customer needs and market conditions. The Hudson's Bay Company maintained their expertise in customer service, supply chain management, and community relationships while transitioning from wilderness trading to urban retail operations. This enabled them to survive the end of their monopoly and build successful competitive businesses. Contemporary companies facing digital disruption, climate change, or global economic shifts could learn from the Hudson's Bay Company's approach to managing fundamental business model transformation while preserving institutional capabilities that provide sustainable competitive advantages. The Hudson's Bay Company's 350-year corporate history ultimately demonstrates that long-term business success requires balancing power with responsibility, efficiency with equity, and profit with purpose in ways that create sustainable value for all stakeholders, rather than just maximizing returns for corporate shareholders. This lesson remains as relevant today as it was when 17 London merchants convinced King Charles II to grant them ownership of half a continent. So we've seen how 17 London merchants convinced a desperate king to hand them ownership of half a continent. We've watched them build a commercial empire that lasted longer than the Roman occupation of Britain. We've witnessed their transformation from territorial monopoly to competitive cooperation, surviving every challenge that destroyed their rivals. Today, over 350 years after their royal charter, the Hudson's Bay Company continues operating as one of North America's largest retail corporations. Walk into any Hudson's Bay store in Toronto or Vancouver, and you're entering a business that once governed territory from the Arctic Ocean to the American Midwest. Buy one of their iconic point blankets, and you're purchasing a product that served as currency throughout much of the North American continent. But the real significance goes far beyond corporate survival stories. The Hudson's Bay Company's territorial empire fundamentally shaped how Canada developed as a nation. Their trading post network became the skeleton around which Canadian cities grew. Their transportation routes became the highways and railways that connected Canadian regions. Their relationships with Indigenous nations established patterns of negotiated cooperation that, while deeply flawed and often exploitative, created different traditions than the military conquest that characterized American Western expansion. Without Hudson's Bay Company territorial control, Western Canada would likely have become part of the United States during the 19th century. The geographic framework that made Canadian Confederation possible was largely created by a commercial monopoly that most modern Canadians have never heard of. The company also demonstrated something remarkable about institutional adaptation. When their monopoly ended, they didn't disappear or retreat to irrelevance. They transformed their business model, embraced competition, and found new ways to serve customers in a changing marketplace. Few corporations survive major disruptions to their fundamental business models. Even fewer managed to thrive for centuries while adapting to completely different economic and political environments. Yet the Hudson's Bay Company's success also came with enormous costs that we shouldn't ignore or romanticize. Their monopoly control restricted economic opportunities for countless settlers who might have developed more prosperous and innovative communities under competitive conditions. Their relationship with Indigenous nations, while more cooperative than many colonial enterprises, still contributed to cultural disruption and economic dependency that had devastating long-term consequences. Their extraction of wealth from North America primarily benefited London shareholders rather than the communities where that wealth was generated. The company's territorial empire was built on 17th-century assumptions about corporate authority and governmental power that most modern democracies would consider illegitimate. The idea that a commercial corporation could exercise sovereign authority over vast territories and diverse populations contradicts fundamental principles of democratic governance and human rights. But here's what's fascinating. The Hudson's Bay Company succeeded